समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
The East is to be opened and transformed, a Princeton University professor of international politics wrote in the Atlantic magazine in 1901. The standards of the West are to be imposed upon it. The professor thought this was a fantastic thing because he went on and said, nations and peoples which have stood still through the centuries are to be quickened and made part of the universal world of commerce and of ideas which has so steadily been a making by the advance of European power from age to age. It is our peculiar duty, as it is also England's, to moderate the process in the interests of liberty. Hi, and welcome to this edition of The Print Explorer. Later this week, American President Donald Trump will be meeting with China's Xi Jinping to discuss, well, the war in Iran, the structure of global trade, the restrictions on rare earth minerals and high-tech technology, silicon chips, the risk of a conflict over Taiwan. The two sides, it's been suggested, don't particularly want to be friends, but have very little choice but to cooperate given how enmeshed their economies are. Few people knew the obscure academic who made the speech I began this episode with. 10 years after he wrote that article, he became governor of New Jersey, and just 2 years after that, in 1913, Woodrow Wilson became President of the United States. And as he predicted, European power and capital did in fact remake China and eventually entwined it in the structure of global capitalism. Trade, technology, Taiwan, Tehran, and of course the really important issue, TikTok. These are the issues Trump and Xi will be discussing when they meet in Beijing. There's obviously no way to know yet how any of these issues are going to play out at this summit meeting, the second one of Trump's second term. The real question is, what do the two preeminent powers of the world today, which together are estimated to control more than 40% of the world's economic activity, actually want from each other? Let's begin with what we do know. The Trump who will be meeting Xi seems not to be the hawk of his first term or even the first few months of his second term. Last year, soon after Trump took office, officials from the Pentagon took him a draft of the National Defense Strategy, which lays out the contours of government policy. The officials thought they were writing it for a leader hostile to China, but discovered otherwise. Trump ordered them to tone down the language, and the version which was published in January simply said Trump sought, I quote, a stable peace, fair trade, and respectful relations. Everywhere in Washington, there's this sort of strange stillness after the storm feeling to do with China. Leading China critic David Faith, who had sought restrictions on the country's investments in America and wanted to reduce its access to technology, was summarily fired from the National Security Council. Experts at the Commerce Department who'd been working on a project meant to block Chinese technology projects that could exploit weaknesses in American cybersecurity resigned when they were blocked from ending the use of TP-Link routers. And that's not all. Treasury czars Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer were stopped from squeezing Chinese access to technology as they planned to do. The White House grey eminence Stephen Miller serves as a kind of envoy at large across the executive, ensuring that nothing is done to upset China without Trump's express consent. Even a routine order blacklisting Alibaba because it undertakes contracts for the People's Liberation Army was reserved. Further evidence of Trump's call it a tilt, call it getting back to the center, emerged when the administration prevented Taiwan President Lai Ching-te from stopping over in New York on his way to Central and South America, a gesture obviously intended to placate China. Similarly, the Trump administration has blocked or at least delayed $400 million worth of weapons earmarked for Taiwan. What happened? Again, the whole picture isn't clear, but many administration insiders seem to think that Trump simply overplayed his hand. This story dates back to 2018 when Trump put in place what were, at that time of course, not now, considered very dramatic tariffs. Following a determination by the United States Trade Representative that China stole American technology and engaged in discriminatory trade practices, tariffs of between 7.5% and 25% kicked in on a large swathe of products. 2 years later, Trump accepted a vague promise from China to increase its purchases by $200 billion over the 2017 baseline. Now, that promise wasn't kept, to no one's surprise. Estimates by economists show imports did not reach even their 2018 level, leave alone $200 billion more than that. Elected last year, Trump came into office for the second time with the moral halo of a man who'd been wronged. America, he asserted, had been duped by China and other foreign countries once too often. Trump's mind, I'm guessing, had turned to Japan, a country whose success in the 1980s had earned the fear and anger of many Americans. As has often been the case, Trump's grievances with Japan were quite personal. The Japanese firm C. Ito had outbid Trump at the auction of a 58-key piano used at the movie Casablanca. And for the most part, Trump's efforts to break into the Tokyo property market failed because his business interlocutors didn't think he was as important as he considered himself. Trump began railing against Saudi Arabia and Japan still in the late 1980s, accusing them of ripping off the United States. Then Trump watched from the sidelines in 1993 as President Bill Clinton, who had run for election as an economic populist, took on Japan. That year, the Clinton administration proposed numerical targets for Japanese exports from America and threatened a 100% tariff on goods like luxury cars when Japan did not agree. Asian countries, fearing the same fate lay ahead for them, of course backed Japan. But American businesses which imported from Japan or had ties to its financial sector also balked at these duties. Trump, his friends claim, came to the conclusion that Clinton had made a mistake. He'd been just too weak-kneed in the negotiations and backed down, and vowed to himself that he would do it better if he ever got a chance. The lesson Trump took from his own 2018 tariff showdown was that China would not retaliate. The country just had too much invested in its trade relationship to risk a breakdown, the argument went. All America had to do was demonstrate resolve. President William McKinley had done exactly that in 1901, after all, when he sent the Marines into Tientsin and on to Beijing to crush a rebellion in China. Yes, that same President William McKinley, who Trump has said he venerates, was his role model for his protectionist economic policies and for the long shadow his gunboats cast across Latin America, for making America the master of the world between the Atlantic and the Pacific. There's a less known story about President McKinley Trump hasn't, to my knowledge, talked about, but is well known to any school kid in China. And it's something we should understand carefully to figure out where this is all headed. Every nation, all peoples, all humans, every one of us, I guess, build stories for themselves to explain their place in the world and the future they hope to build for themselves. Families, communities, nations, all have a tale. The article I began this episode with was written by President Woodrow Wilson in 1901 when he was teaching at Princeton. Now, of course, he was a long way from taking power, but when he did, his first actions was to give China's nationalist government, which had just had a revolution toppling the Manchu dynasty's last emperor, Wilson gave this government diplomatic recognition. And he was to help craft a great power agreement not to carve up China when the country was weakened by this revolution and the infighting that followed it. There is an American story about its relationship with China, and there's a Chinese story about the relationship with America too. These are not the only stories, of course, but it's important to understand that these two narratives don't fit very well together. At their first meeting in 2017, security personnel from Trump and Xi's delegation ended up in a fist fight just outside the conference room where the two were meeting after someone objected to the American president's nuclear weapon suitcase being taken inside. Nobody knows exactly why this fight broke out, but lots of people saw the fight. And it tells me something about the tensions under this relationship, that such a small matter, which is a matter of two security agencies figuring out something quite simple, that it escalated to the point where people were ready to hit each other. Wilson, as we've seen, believed it was important that imperial power be tempered by some sort of universal moral principle. The language he used in his 1901 speech about the East being held to the West standards, most of us would find pretty offensive today. But the idea of the white man's burden was not uncommon at the time. Karl Marx, who was no friend of capitalism or colonialism, made much the same argument in a series of 1853 essays, where he condemned the depredations of empire, but also felt that these depredations would wake up and modernize Asia. Eugene Trani, a historian, has argued that Wilson's China policy was shaped by Presbyterian missionaries he knew from his university years, which makes sense. And this was a moral crusade to remake China as a modern country. Now, Trump obviously isn't a Princeton University professor. Though he went to an Ivy League college, he graduated without honors and didn't trouble himself seeking a master's degree. And even though Trump does ally himself with some of the more extreme elements in America's Christian landscape, I'm pretty sure he doesn't have that much interest in preaching the gospel to the poorest or other missionary enterprises. I'm pretty sure, though, that Trump's position on China isn't just about money either, and that's where that story thing comes in. America had become the world power we recognize today by the end of the 19th century. From 1774 to 1909, America grew at an average rate of some 4% a year, a surge unprecedented in history. By 1913, the economic historian Robert Goldman teaches us, America had an economy that was more than twice the size of Great Britain and bigger than Great Britain, France, and Germany put together. Quite amazing, isn't it? Yet, America was not, in a proper sense, an imperial power. For example, even though it had a trade relationship with China as early as 1784, when a Philadelphia merchant sent a ship called the Empress of China to Guangzhou, the leading role was left to the private sector. The state didn't get into all this too much. President McKinley resisted calls from Britain as well as imperial ideologues like Brooks Adams and Alfred Mahan. We'll talk about one of these days for their role in shaping America's grand strategy. He ignored their calls to become more enmeshed in the rising power struggle between various European colonial powers and Japan, of course, which was also a colonial power in China. Fear began to mount in Washington, though, about just where this superpower competition over China might lead. Following the humiliating defeat of its armed forces by Japan in 1894-1895, China had been forced to cede Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan, and the Penghu Islands, all to Japan. Japan also secured indemnities, which amazingly ensured that the war it had initiated returned a profit. Even as European powers tried to figure out how they would dismantle and carve up what remained of the Chinese state, American Secretary of State John Hay issued an absolutely extraordinary set of diplomatic notes proposing a compact between the great powers that would give all nations equal rights to trade. And this was revolutionary. It had never happened anywhere in the colonial world before. The diplomatic notes issued by Hay, which came to be known as the open door proposals, were almost derailed by events. From 1899 to 1901, a popular revolt flared across Shandong and the North China plains, targeting foreigners and converts to Christianity. Led by martial arts societies known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, the rebellion was a consequence of the growing influence of foreign interests over China. 8 nations, led by American gunboats, for the first time sailed in and crushed the rebellion. Following the Kuomintang party-led nationalist revolution in 1912, Wilson, as I mentioned, accorded diplomatic recognition to the new government. The new government, though, didn't provide stability to China. It created more chaos. The leader of the revolution, Sun Yat-sen, was forced into exile, while the elected president Yuan Shikai declared himself emperor. The United States was able to leverage its influence to dissuade Europe and Japan from stepping in and taking over whatever they wanted. America's use of force against the rebels, though, did not endear it to Chinese nationalists. Exclusionary immigration policies, which had denied Chinese entry to America since 1902, also provoked a lot of bitterness. Then President Wilson ended up by alienating Chinese nationalists by going along after the end of the First World War with a French-British agreement to grant German enclaves in China to Japan. Wilson argued that the agreement was the necessary price to sustain the First World War alliance against Germany. Of course, that alliance included France and Japan, which now wanted their pound of flesh. American policy began to cave in on itself soon afterwards. The nationalist government soon was taken over by various warlords, and there was chronic instability in Beijing with various figures taking over, kicking the last guy out, and then somebody else coming and fighting to capture the seat. The Kuomintang finally recaptured power in 1928, and America became the first country to give this government recognition. Again, though, this gave way to an internecine conflict between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang, who were initially part of the same sort of nationalist spectrum of opinion. Even as both sides fought the Japanese invasion from 1937, they continued to also fight each other. Even as foreign service officers, American foreign service officers, repeatedly warned that this communist nationalist showdown could lead to a big civil war, America allowed relations with the Kuomintang's Chiang Kai-shek to deteriorate. General George Vinegar Joe Stilwell, one of the most eccentric and amazing characters to fight in the Second World War and conduct American operations in the East, pushed Washington to provide arms to the communists, seeing them as more organized, more honest, and better allies in the war that was then going on in Burma. To ordinary Chinese, meanwhile, American troops began to look more and more like occupiers, just like the Japanese were. Now, America wasn't there as an occupier, it was there giving the nationalist government vast aid, but the casual racism of some American soldiers, some very ill-advised sexual relationships with local women in China, and the high standard of living of these foreigners all were sources of resentment. General Chiang Kai-shek, of course, won material support by gaining favor with America, but it came at the cost of his legitimacy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the legendary wartime president, hoped to bring about some kind of coalition government in which both the Communist Party and the Kuomintang would be represented. The effort sadly led nowhere. Ambassador Patrick Hurley resigned in 1945, protesting American policies, he said, used I quote, all our reputation to undermine democracy and bolster imperialism and communism. General George Marshall, who made an unsuccessful 11th hour effort to mediate a truce between the CCP and the Kuomintang, blamed hardliners in both parties for the failure to come to an agreement. The elder Mao Zedong waited his American guest in a new suit and new shoes specially bought for the occasion. American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger would later recall that at their history-making meeting in February 1972, Mao, wearing that new suit, shook hands with him for almost an entire minute. Even though the two countries had spent a quarter century in deeply hostile relations after the collapse of General Marshall's mission and the Communist Revolution, Mao still believed that there had been something special about America. He was a deep admirer of George Washington, America's founding father, and his long war against British colonialism. Mao had hoped he would be able to ally with America in the war against Japan. And he sought a united front against fascism. He'd welcomed, in fact, Marshall's mediation effort. America, clumsy as its effort had been, had tried to partner with a nation and its people, not just extract what could be had from a desperately poor people like the British. Kissinger's visit, as we know, began China's development into the prosperous country Mao had hoped for, enjoying also the centrality in the world it believed it had always been entitled to. Then Donald Trump happened. Again, so it seemed to many Chinese policymakers, an imperial power was seeking to cut China to size. And China decided it had to push back, or it would suffer humiliation of the kind it did at the hands of the West for a century. When Trump's second term began, his team believed America held all the cards. We know it believed this because it publicly said so. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent boasted that China was holding only the proverbial poker deck of a pair of twos to his aces. This wasn't unreasonable, I should say, in fairness. After all, American exports to China were 1/5 of China's exports to America. Huge trade surplus for the Chinese. Americans also had technology that China desperately needed, like advanced semiconductors, as well as the equipment that's used to make those semiconductors. Faced with tariff threats, though, and sanctions on technology, China decided it could struggle through with less advanced chips, but decided to use its near monopoly of rare earths to inflict real pain. American production of electric cars, wind turbines, advanced manufacturing, many other vital military applications all depended on rare earth minerals. As I had explained in an earlier episode of Explorer, rare earths aren't actually rare despite their name. They are huge environmental dangers, though, involved in processing them in their refining and mining, which had led the US to shift much of its production to China very soon after that meeting between Kissinger and Mao. Trump's poker hand has obviously been further weakened in recent weeks by the blows delivered to his tariff policy in American courts. So all the aces Trump thought he'd be holding when he went to Berlin seem to have been burned out. They've all sort of strangely transformed in his hand from aces into ones. What happens next? Well, America might offer to slow down or reverse arms sales to Taiwan, a key demand Beijing has been making for a long time. Earlier this month, Taiwan's legislature allotted funds for high mobility artillery rocket systems, M109A7 self-propelled howitzers and anti-drone missiles, as well as Javelin and TOW anti-tank guided missile systems. A second round of funding is meant to take place to allocate resources for anti-ballistic missile defense systems and low and medium altitude air defense systems and counter-drone systems, as well as the replenishment of anti-tank guided missiles. America will be asked by China to delay those sales or, put them aside. Trump listening to this demand would leave American allies across the world feeling extremely anxious. But the president has already shown that he doesn't care overmuch for the sentiments of his allies. Then the second issue China is likely to seek some resolution over is the Iran war. Even though China is relatively well protected against energy shocks, it's made big investments in coal, nuclear, renewables, high hydrocarbon prices will hurt China, but also the countries that buy Chinese goods. And American sanctions on some Chinese energy companies have also pinched. America has been repeatedly telling the Chinese it does not want them to sell weapons to Iran. If Beijing agrees, it's bound to ask for a pound or many pounds of flesh. Finally, America will be seeking some understanding on the rare earth minerals issue. Even though America is investing billions of dollars today in securing stockpiles of rare earth minerals across the world, creating mining and refining capabilities will take time. It's not something you can turn on and off. Last year, after the summit meeting in Busan, Xi and Trump had announced that they had reached some understanding on the issue. Looking at the trade figures, though, it's hard to see that understanding at work. China sold only 20 tons, exported only 20 tons in January 26, less than a third of the level in January 25, and it stayed like that in the months since. Xi has reason not to jump too quickly to make a deal. Trump's electoral popularity is in free fall, if we're to believe the opinion polls. And there are signs many lawmakers in his party still seek the traditional hard line on China. Republican Congressman John Molinar, who heads the Select Committee on China, has introduced a bill seeking to limit Chinese investments in purchasing farmland. Who knows where that will head? If the Chinese government comes to the conclusion that Trump's policies will be replaced by a successor or will not be durable, it has reason to hold out. For more than a century, America and China have believed they're the two ends of the pole around which the world revolves. But the two ends of the pole have been pulling the rest of it in different directions. Long periods of rapprochement and engagement have given way to extended breakdowns in the relationship. This was, of course, also a feature of the Cold War. But in the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union were not partners in a shared economic order. Even if the Trump-Xi meeting goes nowhere then, the dialogue will sooner or later resume, even if it's made up only of misunderstandings and suspicions. For the good of the world, though, these two great powers have to find a middle path so they can live together. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.